Now, when looking at deploying MDM, there are a few deployment considerations. The first is the device type. Are we going to use corporate-owned devices, or are we going to allow the users to bring in their own device, BYOD? And also, what's the user type or the device role? Is the device a kiosk machine? Is the user an executive, or are they an information worker? So these are part of the considerations when we're looking at MDM deployment, is the type of device and the role or the user that the device is going to have when accessing the corporate resources. And when deploying MDM, another thing we need to take into consideration are what are called organizational groups. Let me break this down for you. We need to identify what's called a use case and a sub-use case. We even have a couple more components. So let me give you an example of this. A case, then we have a sub-use case, and even further we can go down to a case, a sub-use case, and an organization group. We can even go down to platform and apps. But let me give you an example of this. A use case could be the corporate, a sub-use case would be the executive within corporate, and the org group would be the executive that's part of HR or part of finance. So we'll create policies based on the organizational group. Now I mentioned we can break this down into further detail. So let's look at mobile device use cases along with platforms and apps. So what we have here is we have corporate like we had above. We have the executives at the corporate level. Within departments or organizational group, there are HR and finance. And now we're drilling it down to the executives within HR and finance that are using an iOS operating system. We can further refine this for the executives in HR and finance that are using iOS, and I want to control email. I want to control their profiles. I want to control the apps that they're using. So we can get very, very granular with exactly how much we want to control when using MDM, so the device types and the organizational groups are part of your deployment considerations for MDM. After we've gone through the considerations for the deployment of MDM, we're going to want to deploy it. So we're going to begin by choosing the appropriate authority solution based on the tools that we're going to use to manage the MDM deployment. Now, for the planning for the MDM infrastructure, there's a few things we want to take into consideration. And the first option within planning for the MDM infrastructure is external communications. How are we going to communicate our expectations from our external users? In addition to that, we're going to look at bandwidth requirements, because remember, your users are going to be accessing and downloading apps quite frequently. So we have to make sure we're not bogging down our bandwidth with these mobile device updates. And within bandwidth requirements, we can restrict or control the amount of bandwidth that's being impacted by using a proxy server, which is really a caching proxy server, and this is used to cache certain types of content of redundant downloads from multiple devices. Another option for controlling the network bandwidth is called delivery optimization. This is primarily for Windows 10, but it's a cloud-managed solution that helps reduce bandwidth consumption when it comes to downloading of content. And it's done by leveraging peer caching technology. And this is achieved by sharing package contents between devices on a per deployment basis. In addition, we also need to plan for device policies. And we have a couple different areas we need to be aware of. The first is what is called policy conflicts. Once a device is enrolled in MDM, you can then create and assign multiple new policies to manage that device. Some of them may overlap, so we have to set up the priority of those policies to ensure we achieve what we're trying to achieve for managing that device. Another one is called Unified Management. These policies are available in MDM for Office 365 as well as Microsoft Intune, which provide additional controls for managing your devices. These are evolving policies, so they change quite frequently, so you want to be sure you're always familiar with the most recent policy that's available for you as you're deploying MDM. Now, the deployment of the MDM can be quite a lengthy process and quite a daunting task if you're not familiar with it. So there are three primary MDM deployment plans that you're going to build out. And the first plan is called the rollout plan. And this rollout plan will target specific groups, specifically two types of groups. The pilot group, which is where you're going to test the waters with your super users to ensure the deployment process works as expected. After you fine-tune the rollout process, the next one is called the production rollout group. And it doesn't mean it's going to be a single production rollout group. We could create production rollout groups by departments, by platform, or even by geography. The next type of plan is a communication plan, which explains the details of the rollout plan that we created previously. This plan can contain what and how the information is communicated, and it's also going to say who and when that information is communicated. Our third plan is our support plan. Once we roll out MDM, how are we going to resolve any issues? So this plan will include who's involved in the support process, what is the support process, and who and when will provide the training. Anytime we roll out any new functionality, training is going to be the key to the success of that rollout. So we want to make sure we provide sufficient training for our users. Now, I mentioned earlier that our users need to enroll their devices. So let's talk a little bit about device enrollment. And device enrollment allows you to manage your devices as well as the apps and how they access your company data. Remember, we have BYOD, which means they have their own personal information on there, and they may now have some company data. How are we going to manage that? Your devices must be enrolled in Intune, and they must have an MDM certificate for communications. So in order for us to even begin the use of device management, or MDM, we have to make sure the devices are enrolled in Intune and they have to have an MDM certificate. There are some dependencies for the enrollment. The first one we already talked about, device ownership, personal versus company. Device type, we already talked about, iOS, Android, or Windows. And our last dependency is management requirements, and this includes resets, where I simply wipe the device prior to enrollment, locking, where I can prevent the user from unenrolling the device once it's enrolled, and affinity, where I can associate a device with a specific user. Now, by default, all devices are allowed to enroll, but you can restrict enrollment by device type. Let's take a look at how we do that. It's called enrollment limits, and this is managed through the Endpoint Manager Admin Center. It allows you to specify restrictions for enrollment. This could be by number and type of devices, and another option is by operating systems and the versions, the minimum and maximum versions of an operating system. We can create multiple restrictions and set a priority order of those restrictions, and then we apply these restrictions to our user groups. Now, there are some out-of-the-box default restrictions that are available for us, and by default, they apply to all users and user-less enrollments if you're using like kiosk machines, but they can be overridden using custom restrictions with higher priorities. So we'll have to look at out-of-the-box default restrictions, and if we want to tweak those, we need to create custom restrictions and make sure they're a higher priority than the default restrictions. So in this module, we looked at 4 primary topics. The MDM authority solutions. We had 4 of those that we can choose to use to manage MDM. We drilled into more detail around Microsoft 365 Intune. We talked about MDM deployment, specifically some of the considerations that we need to think about prior to completing the MDM deployment. And then we talked about how we can restrict what our users can do with their devices by implementing what are called device enrollment limits. Next up, we're going to roll up our sleeves and take a look at managing mobile device management in Microsoft 365.